back in January, one of the first things that Donald Trump did that I found profoundly cruel was that he canceled a Biden-era policy that prevented ICE from raiding churches, schools, and hospitals. Right? These are sanctuary spaces. These are safe spaces where people should feel that they can go worship, where little children can go to get access to education, be able to go to school, and where people can seek medical care. But ICE has been raiding all three of those spaces consistently all year long. And a while back, I talked about how ICE had been spotted multiple times here in the Portland metro area at both of the children's hospitals. Dornbecker and also Randall Children's Hospital. And today, the Oregon Nurses Association released a statement that I would like to share with you. It's quite long, so this may be a long video, but I think it's important to listen to what they have to say, and I think there are some greater implications here. So let me go ahead and start reading, and as always, I will intersperse with commentary. This letter was sent to the president of Legacy Emmanuel Hospital late yesterday on December 10th, and I got access to it this morning. I have noticed in the last 15 minutes or so, a couple of Oregon news outlets, I think COIN and a couple of others, are now reporting on it as well. So when I post this on YouTube, I will drop a bunch of links into the video description. Dear President Wanley, we are writing to raise concerns over Legacy Emmanuel Medical Center's compliance with state and federal law and Legacy's own policies. I think you're going to see very quickly where my commentary is going to go on this. These concerns center on the Legacy's potential failure to comply with basic tenets of patient confidentiality, patient autonomy over medical decisions, and the Oregon Nurse Practices Act. ONA has received reports that these failures have arisen repeatedly due to the course of care for patients who are also interacting with ICE. Specifically, it appears that LEMC may be failing to adhere to its HIPAA obligations and its own policies. Despite Legacy's policies largely reflecting appropriate compliance with statutory obligations, there is a growing gap between Legacy's written policies and the actual practices nurses are witnessing. As a result, ONA bargaining unit members and their patients are being placed at risk. We are asking you to begin compliance with Legacy policy immediately, as outlined at the conclusion of this letter, and to meet with ONA representatives as soon as possible to confirm and monitor the implementation of those compliant practices. Okay, let me take a little second here at this juncture and add a little bit more context. So one of the reasons that Donald Trump has been so much more successful in advancing his authoritarian agenda during this term in office versus his first term is because we are seeing many companies and institutions that held the line for democracy and vigorously pushed back during Trump's first term very quickly bend the knee during this term. We're seeing far too many institutions roll over for fascism, being willing to go along with the illegal actions of the regime, including ICE. We are seeing far more capitulation from universities like Columbia, from so many media corporations, CNN, Disney, Paramount, ABC, CBS, Big Law. We are seeing all kinds of folks who are willing to bend the knee. And it is so important to understand it is not so much what the regime does, it is very much how we choose to respond. When Donald Trump tries to claim power that he does not have, and institutions and people, instead of holding the line and saying, absolutely not, no, you cannot trample on our rights, you cannot trample on the rights of, in this case, our patients. Instead, what they do is they say, okay, you can go ahead and take that power. We're gonna cower, we're gonna back down. Then, as Leah from Indivisible says, Donald Trump sees you pulling off the line, he reaches forward, he grabs that power, and he pockets it. He says, this is now my power, I get to do this thing. You have given me permission to take away this right from you and to exercise this power. The new normal is I get to do this thing because y'all didn't stand up. And that context is really important to understand this letter from the Oregon Nurses Association to Legacy Emmanuel. The reason that ONA, the reason that Oregon's nurses are having to stand up and push back and hold the line is because their employers apparently aren't. Too many institutions are bending the knee to fascism, whether out of fear of the regime or fear of a loss of their profit. Over and over again, we are seeing folks who held the line the first time around decide to be chicken shit cowards this time around. Not that I'm saying that Legacy is being a chicken shit coward, but let's keep reading here. HIPAA prevents disclosure of protected health information with certain narrow exceptions. By the way, we already know that the Trump regime has given ICE, DHS permission to go in and look at Medicaid records. Right? They're low-key looking at little kids' Medicaid records to see if their parents are undocumented. Whether or not that connects, whether or not that has allowed them to be able to target individuals at hospitals, I don't know. But I do know that DHS is getting into folks' Medicaid records. Okay, at the most basic level, Legacy appears to agree that it is obligated to comply with HIPAA and not to disclose its patients' protected health information, except as specifically allowed under the statute and administrative rule. They go over that statute. It's a little dry, so I'll gloss over it here. Let me skip down a little bit. Disclosure for law enforcement purposes is allowed as provided in 164.512. This regulation provides that covered entities may disclose protected health information to law enforcement officials for law enforcement purposes under the following circumstances and subject to special conditions. Number one, as required by law, including court orders, court warrants, and subpoenas, and administrative requests. Number two, to identify or locate a suspect, a fugitive, a material witness, or a missing person. Or three, in response to a law enforcement official's request for information about a victim or suspected victim of a crime. Four, to alert law enforcement of a person's death if the covered entity suspects that criminal activity was involved in that death. 5, when a covered entity believes that protected health information is evidence of a crime that occurred on its premises. And number 6, by a covered healthcare provider in a medical emergency not occurring on the premises, when necessary to inform law enforcement about the commission and nature of a crime, the location of a crime or crime victims, and the perpetrator of a crime. Do you understand? Those are the legal reasons that HIPAA can be set aside and that information can be shared with law enforcement. In addition, to the extent that an individual is in the custody of ICE officers, disclosure of specific private health information is allowed under the following limited circumstances. Here are the permitted disclosures. A covered entity may disclose to a correctional institution or a law enforcement official having lawful custody of an inmate or other individual protected health information about such inmate or individual if the correctional institution and such law enforcement official represents that such protected health information is necessary for the provision of health care to such individuals, for the health and safety of such individual or other inmates, for the health and safety of the officers or employees of the correctional institution, for the health and safety of individuals and officers or other persons responsible for transporting inmates from one facility to another, for law enforcement on the premises of the correctional institutions, or the administration and maintenance of the safety, security, and good order of the correctional institution. Right? A lot of that has to do with, like, does this inmate have a communicable disease? Is there a significant health risk that this person could pose to law enforcement officers or other inmates? Then disclosure can be made if that person is in lawful ICE custody. Thus, the only relevant authority that would allow disclosure of private health information for detainees in this context is if there is a valid judicial warrant for arrest, or if the individual is in custody and the information is identified as necessary for one or more of the specific purposes that I just listed. As a result, we believe Legacy understands that absent other exceptions being applicable, an employee of Legacy should not disclose PHI, that's private health information, to law enforcement except under these circumstances. We also agree with Legacy that frontline staff should not be placed in a position of having to evaluate whether a specific request satisfies all of these exceptions to the broad prohibition on PHI disclosure. This is the job of management. We demand that managers fill this gap. So moving on, I think we're starting to get some context for those who don't know about the concerns about the way that ICE has been interfacing with hospitals in the Portland metro area and how staff and management at those hospitals has been responding and what the greater implications may be. Let me continue to read from this letter from Ona. On paper, Legacy's policies, and then they list the long names of all 5 of those policies, generally track HIPAA, EMTALA, and basic constitutional protections. All 5 of these policies contain appropriate statements about continued HIPAA protections, the division between public and non-public areas, the limited circumstances under which PHI may be shared, and the role of security and leadership as the primary liaisons with law enforcement. However, Legacy has failed to provide clear lines of authority and decision-making relating to evaluating PHI's disclosures. As a result, nurses across Legacy facilities are reporting day-to-day practices that depart sharply from these written commitments. Confusion and differing standards for different law enforcement agencies, and ultimately the placing of nurses at risk of breaching statutory protections because of Legacy's unwillingness to clearly identify when disclosures of PHI to law enforcement is allowed. These practices place patients and nurses at risk, both clinically and legally, and create a climate of fear and moral distress. Underlying all of these concerns from our members is the distinct desire to appropriately treat their patients. The implication here being including migrants, whether or not they are in ICE custody. And part of this issue is, we'll get into it in a little bit, is that ICE is bringing injured immigrants to Legacy centers, Legacy clinics and hospitals, and demanding that they be treated. And then clearly putting nurses in a position where ICE is trying to get them to violate HIPAA, and it's a serious ethical concern and a serious safety risk for both nurses and patients. Okay, underlying all of these concerns from our members is the distinct desire to appropriately treat their patients and to comply with their obligations to those patients under state and federal law. Below, we outline specific areas where Legacy's practice appears to conflict with its own policies and with governing law, along with concrete examples from nurse reports. We identify steps we expect Legacy leadership to take to bring practice into compliance with both law and policy. I am not going to be reading verbatim here. I'm going to try and break it down a little bit and summarize and jump over some of the parts that contain wordy, kind of dry, detailed descriptions of policy and law. So please bear with me as I try and shorten it up a little bit. Legacy's own policy says that patients in custody, suspects, fugitives, material witnesses, detainees, that their rights are intact, except in a limited, clearly defined set of circumstances, which we went over earlier. However, nurses report being told by management, in substance, that detainees do not maintain the same HIPAA rights as other patients. As a result, we have received reports that ICE officers are being allowed to remain at the bedside at all times during sensitive exams, mental health assessments, and bathroom use. That ICE agents refuse to step away even when nurses or providers request privacy for clinically appropriate reasons. That ICE agents are observing and overhearing all clinical discussions, regardless of content or sensitivity. Most troubling, it has been reported that Legacy managers' direction to nurses has been, you can ask ICE to step back or leave the room, but if they refuse, do not question them further. What the hell, Legacy? What are you doing? You're bending the knee to fascism. Sounds like you're doing wrong by your nurses and your patients. Undocumented immigrants, and let's be really clear here, that is not all of the folks that ICE is bringing to Legacy facilities. They're not all undocumented. They have basic HIPAA rights too. HIPAA, EMTALA, and constitutional rights all apply to undocumented immigrants or anybody inside a hospital. It's going to get worse. Hang in there with me, y'all. It's going to get worse. I thought I was really upset the first time I read through this letter, but reading it through again out loud makes me even angrier. HIPAA does not contain any kind of detainee exceptions to HIPAA compliance, nor do Legacy's policies. The constant presence of officers at the bedside and in the bathrooms does not constitute a valid authorization to access or overhear any and all private health information. They go on to talk about failures of management, failures to adhere to the policy. As a result, the current practice undermines HIPAA's reasonable safeguards requirement, violates the spirit and arguably the letter of policy for Legacy, places nurses in an untenable situation caught between their legal and professional obligations and instructions not to challenge law enforcement behavior, even if it is plainly interfering with care and I would add illegal. Just a reminder that ICE chuddies have no training. They are not legitimate law enforcement. They are not trained. They don't know the law. They are freely, clearly trampling the law all over the place. And apparently inside Legacy Emmanuel hospitals is no exception. And we see management at Legacy greenlighting that practice, at least according to this letter from Ona here. Legacy has no standard process for identifying whether ICE agents have legal authority to access private health information. While we recognize that there are circumstances where healthcare workers may disclose PHI to law enforcement, those circumstances must be appropriately documented. This is the only means of ensuring that patients' protections are in place and that Legacy is not violating federal law. At a minimum, there is no clear decision-making process and documentation standards for the following. Number 1, confirmation by a manager that a patient is subject to a judicial warrant or is in the custody of law enforcement. I mean, this is par for the course with ICE, right? Because they're taking people all over the place when they do not have a judicial warrant. It is not legal for ICE to snatch people out of their homes, off the street, out of hospitals. They are not allowed to arrest you without a judicial warrant. We are seeing that practice violated over and over again. And in the last 6 months, I think a lot of people have forgotten that fact. They can't just come snatch anybody. They can't just break into your home without a warrant, but we are seeing that happen time and time and time again. I am just reminding you, do not let that become normalized. What ICE is doing is illegal. And in the future, in the post-Trump era, I look forward to the congressional investigations. I look forward to the prosecutions. The nurses go on to say they want placing of that determination that there is a judicial warrant and documentation of such in the patient's medical record. Documentation of law enforcement requests are also requested for information that are consistent with the scope of release. Documentation of specific releases that have been made to law enforcement in response to their requests all need to happen, and they're not happening right now, according to ONA. They go on to say, as a result of what can only be described as a failure to abide by some of the most basic healthcare practices relating to the release of confidential information, Legacy's haphazard practices are placing nurses, patients, providers, and Legacy itself at legal risk. The concerns we are raising arise from or are compounded by the failure to abide by these standards. Now, one of the things I've learned working with Signs for Solidarity, if you're not familiar with that project, Indivisible has a whole page on it, is that when you go to business owners and you communicate to them, like, hey, there are public and non-public spaces inside your business. ICE cannot go inside non-public spaces without a warrant. That's why we encourage business owners to have a closet or a back room that has a sign, private area, employees only, non-public space, something like that. ICE cannot enter into that section without a warrant. Which leads me to the next part of ONA's letter here. As described above under federal law and Legacy policy, there is a clear distinction between public areas, main lobbies, public parking, etc., and non-public areas, patients' rooms, ED treatment areas, exam rooms, internal corridors, clinic lobbies and waiting rooms, spaces marked employees only or private. Officers should be excluded from non-public areas unless authorized by management or in response to lawful exceptions as described above. While officers may overhear or see something in a public area, the hospital has a continuing duty to limit unnecessary exposure of public health information. Legacy cannot abide by its obligations to limit inadvertent exposures while in no way limiting ICE officers from being in these private areas. Skipping down a bit here, according to reports we have received, there are ongoing instances of the following: multiple ICE and other federal agents clustered in or around patient rooms and emergency department bays. Officers roaming halls and units rather than remaining strictly with their detainee. Enforcement presence far more intense than afforded to patients in Portland Police Bureau or Sheriff's custody. This magnifies the risk of incidental PHI exposure for other patients, creates a climate of intimidation in clinical areas affecting patients and staff, and is inconsistent with the more measured approach reportedly taken with local law enforcement. What I find concerning so far about this letter, many things, it's gonna get worse, just hang in there, is that not only does it appear that Legacy is not enforcing their own policies, specifically when it comes to ICE, in a way that puts both their patients at risk, also puts their healthcare providers in a precarious legal situation. but that they are applying those policies differently for local law enforcement versus ICE. They appear to be granting special favors for ICE or bending the knee, backing off, refusing to comply with their own policy and federal law only when it comes to ICE. If your hackles weren't up enough already, let's continue. Legacy's actions threaten to impair patient autonomy and caregiver clinical decision-making. Legacy's communications rightfully emphasize that health and safety come first and that patients receive medically necessary care regardless of their status. However, our members have reported that Legacy has not lived up to its own standards. For instance, nurses report the following. ICE officers have reportedly pressured nurses and physicians to skip assessments, tests, and monitoring in order to move patients out more quickly. Nurses have reported instances where physicians have recommended continued hospitalization, but ICE insisted on removing the patient, effectively forcing discharge over clinical advice. I cannot convey how concerning this is. To me, from my completely lay position, that sounds like ICE is preventing detainees from getting medically necessary care that their providers have said that they recommend. It's gonna get worse, y'all. In some cases, nurses report that detainee patients have had little or no opportunity to participate meaningfully in these decisions, meaning their own healthcare decisions. The officers simply announce, "We're going," and Legacy staff are left to accommodate. Custody affects where a patient is. It does not transform law enforcement into surrogate decision makers. When ICE or other law enforcement agents insist that patients be removed over the objections of treating providers, there is a potential EMTALA exposure, particularly in emergency department and unstable cases. There is a particular conflict with standard of care obligations and basic informed consent principles. Legacy appears to be prioritizing law enforcement convenience over its own commitment to health and safety first. This is shocking. This is unbelievably concerning. You know that it took a large volume of evidence. It took nurses making report after report for ONA to come together and put this letter. You can tell they did not put it together lightly. The accusations here are egregious. At a minimum, nurses should be trained on the potential for ICE's insistence on discharge against medical advice, documentation practices, and if these events do occur, these cases should trigger automatic review by risk management and compliance. Right now, nurses experience pressure from law enforcement without any direction or support from leadership, from management at the hospital. Skipping down a little bit in the letter here, in the name of brevity in this very long video, prevention of nurse from educating patients about their federal rights. Legacy's communication memo and ICE Q&A emphasize that staff should not provide legal advice and should route immigration-related questions through social work, legal, or compliance offices. None of these documents explicitly require staff to block all communication between patients in custody and their families or lawyers. None explicitly prohibit staff from sharing Know Your Rights information with each other as coworkers. No known policy would prevent a nurse from informing a patient about their rights to make decisions relating to their own care. Nevertheless, we have received reports that nurses have been told that they may not give detainee patients Know Your Rights cards or similar materials. Nurses have been instructed that they may not call patient family members while the patient is in ICE custody, but may only call family after the patient leaves and only if the patient requested it. Please understand that that is what ICE is doing consistently so that family doesn't know if their loved one has been injured by ICE or otherwise and is in the hospital. That is a way to prevent family members from knowing if their loved one is in the hospital, potentially seriously injured. Could you imagine if you were abducted by ICE, they hurt you, you end up in the hospital and they say, your family can't come see you. In fact, we're going to make sure that your family doesn't even know that you're here. They also note that chaplains and social workers are not being consistently mobilized to support communication or referrals. Blanket prohibitions from Legacy go beyond the caution in your policies about avoiding legal advice and instead impair nurses as they exercise their nursing obligation to educate and advocate for patient care. Go on to describe how, as a result of this preferential treatment for ICE and clear violations of the law and policy, patients' ability to make decisions over their own care or to contact counsel or family is chilled or blocked. Nurses are pressed into enforcing a communications blackout that your policies do not expressly require, and staff have no clear guidance on what is permissible when a patient asks basic questions about contacting loved ones or legal counsel. The next section is about staff intimidation. Nurses, especially nurses of color and immigrant nurses, report feeling unsafe and intimidated when ICE and other federal agents are present. I'm not surprised by that at all. Some describe carrying extra identification at work, avoiding eye contact with officers, or taking steps to minimize their own visibility on the unit. Our frontline healthcare workers, these are America's heroes from 2020, right? These are necessary, vital members of our community, and they are made to feel threatened in their own workplace as they are trying to do their job. ICE is fear and terror and intimidation everywhere they go, including inside America's hospitals. Legacy, your standard process document, makes security and leadership responsible for managing law enforcement behavior and presence. Yet officers appear to be setting the terms, and leadership rarely intervenes, leaving the nurse in the role of having to care for patients in the face of these policy breaches. The letter then goes on to demand, or request, I should say, immediate compliance with Legacy's policies and federal law. They include increasing documentation of interactions with ICE, which ICE personnel arrive, verifying their credentials, verifying whether they have a warrant, record agent name, badge number, date, and time in a centralized log. They request increased charting to describe circumstances of arrest, who brought the patient in, the reason for the visit, observed behavior, documenting everything that happens. They request that patients be provided with education, including preservation of their own medical decision-making, know your rights material, and access to social support services, such as immigration and legal resources. They discuss widespread violations of due process and restricted access to legal counsel amongst detained individuals, and how that raises serious Sixth Amendment violation concerns. They want it reaffirmed in writing that patients in ICE or other custody are protected by HIPAA and other various policies. They would like to see enforcement on limits of officer presence in non-public private areas. They would like standards set for reasonable limits on the numbers of officers at bedside or in clinical areas. Please understand, these are immigrants who are not violent criminals. They're not criminals. They're not dangerous. They're not a threat to anybody. These huge numbers of ICE agents, first of all, that justifies having so many ICE agents that are getting a bunch of our tax money, but it also is setting that aura. It is setting that tone of intimidation, right? An excessive amount of law enforcement is communicating like we're big and powerful, and we will make sure that this person's rights are trampled, and there's so many of us, you are threatened and intimidated, and you will not push back. It's all about chilling dissent. It's all about letting them trample on your rights, trample on the rights of patients in their custody. The nurses go on to list a number of other very clear, reasonable, legal recommendations. And I encourage you to go read their whole letter. It's quite long, but it is worth a read. They also say they want a commitment from the hospital for no retaliation for nurses who report concerns or who document law enforcement interference with care. I was shocked when I read this letter. This is Portland, Oregon. This is Portland, Oregon, a sanctuary city in a sanctuary state, and to hear that ICE is being given such tremendous courtesy, such space to violate the law by hospital staff, administrators, managers, clearly not nurses and doctors who feel intimidated, but from the higher ups. Imagine what's happening in other hospitals around this country when we see administrators, when we see managers being willing to bend the knee, being willing to hand over their patients' constitutional rights, their HIPAA rights, their EMTALA rights to ICE chuddies, to the authoritarian regime of Donald Trump. This is shocking and horrifying. This should not be happening, and I applaud the Oregon Nurses Association for raising awareness, for standing up on behalf of their patients, on behalf of nurses. And I hope this story gets a tremendous amount of coverage. This story needs to be spread everywhere. If this is happening in Portland, it's happening all over the country. I am back to finish this video. I had to go to a meeting in the Centennial neighborhood here in Portland, but I'm not done because I don't want to leave y'all with like, holy shit. What? Okay, first of all, what just happened in the kitchen? No broken dishes, no broken dishes. The 17-year-old is just cooking a snack. I think it sounds like the 23-year-old as well. So I don't want to leave y'all with this feeling of like, oh my gosh, hospitals are not safe. Everybody left and right is just bowing to fascism. But I also never want to sugarcoat. I don't want to gloss over important stories of when institutions are failing us. It's important that we face these problems head on, right? We don't want to underestimate the severity of the problem. And as I said way back at the beginning of this video, one of the reasons that Donald Trump was not very successful last time in his first term in his attempt to institute authoritarianism is because institutions held the line over and over and over. And this time around, we're watching inexplicably places that should be bastions of democracy standing up for the rule of law, deciding that they're going to bow to fascism. Universities like Columbia, they're not the only one. I don't have time to get into an exhaustive list right now. Yes, lots of universities have come together to form a coalition, I think of like 240 colleges and universities that are sharing resources and holding the line together. But we've seen some pretty significant movement from a number of schools to just like throw their students under the bus. Decide like not to listen to their poli-sci and history departments at all, but rather to be compliant with fascism because they think that it'll save their endowments or some shit like that they'll continue to get grants from the government, right? It's all about money. It's all about how you can protect money. Likewise, we've seen huge law firms like Paul Weiss, like Skadden, that were known for representing Democrats and pro-democracy causes, decide to just hand over millions and millions of dollars of free legal service to Donald Trump for no reason when other law firms have come together and been like, no way. Paul Weiss was just like, oh yeah, we'll freely offer up, what was it, like $80 or $100 million worth of free legal service that previously they would have spent pro bono on like environmental groups. Organizations fighting for justice, organizations fighting against illegal actions from the government. Now they've decided like, oh, we'll just be an arm of fascism. We'll just be fully compliant because we don't want to lose our security clearance and our government contracts. We don't want to lose access to these cases that need us to have a high level of security clearance, I should say. So we'll just throw democracy under the bus. We've seen this over and over again when all of these folks held the line previously. I do not have like any window into the insight of these institutions to understand why they have betrayed all of us. I hope there's a serious reckoning for them in the post-Trump era. I do actually have insight as to why businesses are doing this because it's money. It's not really any more complicated than money. What I don't have insight into is how they came to that decision. Like, how is it that they decided it would be more profitable to be a fucking bootlicker and be a collaborator with fascism than to hold the line? So I know I've gotten really angry multiple times this year because we're seeing institutions, corporations that could be our allies in the fight for democracy and could have helped us crush this far earlier, decide that they're going to lend their tremendous resources to the assistance, the aid of fascism. They've decided to betray the American people and betray democracy for money. That's something that is really hard for a lot of us to accept. And it can feel really daunting to know that not only do we have to resist against the government, but previously folks who would have been on our side have now decided that they're going to be pillars of support under Donald Trump. They're now going to uphold a frail, fragile, weak would-be dictator and to lend him money and power and authority that he has no right to have. Like, these people have just decided, yeah, I'm just going to simp for fascism. I'm just going to be a bootlicker because I think that it'll make my piggy bank grow. That's really hard. That's hard for a lot of us to accept. And I'm sorry that those folks have been doing that. I'm sorry that those corporations have sold us out. And for me, hearing this story, it was particularly devastating to hear that our hospital systems are doing this. And as I said at the end of the last segment, to hear that our hospital systems are doing this in Portland, Oregon, a sanctuary city in a sanctuary state, it's really difficult. If you are really upset by this, you have every right to be upset. But I don't want to leave it on a bleak note. I said early this morning that I was going to make all my videos today positive, and this might not post till after midnight, so maybe I'll keep my promise. But also here at the end, I want to keep my promise. For me, as devastating as it was to hear from Oregon's nurses about what it's like inside Legacy hospitals right now, I'm just going to remind you, Randall Children's Hospital is owned by Legacy Emmanuel, and we have seen ICE stalking around the parking lot at Randall, as well as at Dornbecker OHSU. But we've heard that OHSU staff has had a very different response from what we're hearing about Legacy. It's really it's horrible. It's horrible to think that our government is not only waiting for like parents of children to leave a hospital in order to snatch them. It's terrible to think that our hospitals are allowing ICE to trample on the HIPAA rights, the constitutional rights, and the safety of immigrants who they have abducted and are keeping in custody. Like, how many of those immigrants end up in the hospital because ICE has brutalized them? How many of those injuries are inflicted by ICE? Those folks get to the hospital, and we're hearing this, Oregon's nurses telling us that ICE is like making sure they supervise. These are not criminals. These are not criminals. They're not giving them privacy in the bathroom. They're not giving privacy in terms of medical procedures, exams that are very private. But they're also making sure that immigrants are denied care. They are taking people out of the hospital AMA. Doctors are saying this person needs to be hospitalized, this person needs the following tests and treatments, and ICE is saying, no, too bad, we're leaving. That cannot be legal. And yet we're seeing nurses put in the position where they're powerless to do anything about it. They're being put in this terrible position where their managers, their higher ups, are not enforcing the law on behalf of patients. And armed men, swarms of armed men, because they've told us that there's just a huge presence. Again, for some guy who works long, hard hours roofing your house or doing, landscaping, some mom who has taken her kid to school and was snatched, they have like a half dozen guys show up, stand there fully strapped up, scaring nurses. Nurses are afraid to do their jobs. Like what a terrible, terrible position not only are immigrants put in, but also our frontline medical workers, America's heroes. Is this what we want in this country? And it can just be really demoralizing to read about this. But for me, the big takeaway is the fact that the ONA put this letter out, made demands of Legacy, was willing to go public with all of this rather than suffer in silence, rather than just be like, okay, well, we just got to go along with hard times, and ICE are really big and terrible and they feel empowered to violate the law and there's nothing we can do. No, our nurses have decided to stand up. And for me, that is the big takeaway from all of this. When institutions fail us, who do we look to? What is it I say all the time? My Indivisible group has this motto, this mantra: who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. For me, it was so encouraging to read this letter and hear how Oregon's nurses are not taking shit from ICE. They're not laying down. They're standing up for their patients. They're standing up for themselves. They're standing up for the rule of law. I realize for me, this was a long video. I hope that everybody will share it because I think this message needs to be broadcast widely. Not only do we need to understand what ICE is doing inside our hospitals and how apparently hospitals, at least in Portland, I'm sure in more conservative states, how hospitals are failing to protect their patients' rights and health and instead are bending the knee for fascism. But I also want people to understand that our nurses are doing the right thing. I also want people to understand that our nurses are willing to stand up and speak out. That is the takeaway. When the rich and powerful, when those who are driven by money, by profit, fail us because they have no moral compass, when institutions decide to be pillars of support for fascism, you know what? We didn't need them to save us. They were never going to save us anyway. It was never going to be politicians. It was never going to be corporations. It was never going to be institutions. We don't need to wait for a savior. It's us, the people. It's us, the people, organizing and coming together and saying, we refuse to comply with this. We will not be silent. We are making sure that we advocate for those who are targeted by the regime. One of the keys of effectively resisting fascism is you do not abandon those that are targeted by the regime. And Oregon's nurses, they understand that. To me, this story is very much about looking to Oregon's nurses for an example of how we organize and resist fascism. We protect the most vulnerable, we speak truth to power, we widely communicate the reality of what's going on, we stand up for ourselves, and we refuse to give up our rights. Thank you, ONA, and I hope the rest of y'all will share this video.